All right. Welcome now to the panel of this cluster. Practice, performance of space, artists and architects, creative in-betweeners that we have here on the table. Maybe we can start off with a very brief statement of each one of you and your understanding of yourself as an artist or like a spatial creator and your approach to space. And we start with one bold statement from each one of you from which we can take the discussion. You want to be the first one?
That's a very, it's too open, no?
For the sake of the discussion.
Just to continue on this, I never know how I actually explain my position because I really work on the border of art and architecture and I don't know, anthropology or something. So maybe this somehow this complexity is one of the problems and maybe one of the new models that we work with. But actually, since we are talking about space here, maybe the one thing that I found it like super interesting in my practice is that space really matters, but it's not the usual definition of abstract space, how we used to talk about it, let's say, like about, let's say, public space, semi-public space. These categories, Euclidean categories are not interesting anymore, but it's more a space produced by people, the ritual and the just organic gathering. I think that became interesting for me.
For me, today in this current environment for myself, I guess, it's just environmental form will continue to be my focus. I'm not much interested in making it discernible. This type of form. I'm not interested in it being completely accessible either. I'm kind of interested in it being elusive somehow, and therefore that complexity is appealing to me. I don't, this idea that I'm very obsessed with producing experimental architecture that has no interior, very much entwined with what Deleuze and Guattari and nomadology of the war machine. This is really where I'm at.
I think I have the same problem. I get that. And therefore I love much more very concrete situation and concrete questions. But obviously that what strikes us is a social space and the tools, the strategies, the tactics, but also the generation of physical space also as a tool how to interfere with the social. I mean it's such a wide range.
And for me it's the same. I'm very much free in the practice, in that I use a wide range of media to express this research-based work, and I try to, through non-didactic aspects, to provoke just plan a seed of thought and conversation and a little bit fight against what I think it's the problem as well today, which is like a sort of collective amnesia, so to re-insert some concepts and associate different situations and to discuss about them.
Thank you very much. This was intended as an entry point, but then now we're getting from the more general questions to the more specific ones. For each one of you have one, then please kind of get in between. I'd like to open a discussion about something that you presented in your work in Marjetica. There was the differentiation between, you started with the formal and the informal, then we went to the rural and the urban. And then this was when I was thinking actually of Jane's talk yesterday, we went to the oral and the written in the form of communication that kind of defines these forms of living. Could you elaborate on this aspect again? We had also the observation that in these informal settlements, also rural settlements within an urban context, the ways of communication are still oral, which is kind of the idea of the classical, the village, the communication in the village is oral. I talk to my neighbor, I talk to the next one, whereas the city is much more formalized then and representational, where a linear code, a written code, kind of gives the directives.
Yeah, exactly. You somehow explained it all, but I would like to add so that while if you are if you follow written regulations, you are just repeating what is written. But if you talk, you construct new knowledge. So I think that's really crucial about oral communication. That we have to talk. This is why also, push for gatherings is now so important, because we have to rethink like how we live together, in my words. But you can do it only by exchanging knowledge between different disciplines and different layers of the society. Because knowledge is never final, but you have to talk to be able to come to a new meaning.
I think now also in certain cities there's also kind of there are all these kind of enormous non-written rules now, or cultural rules. I think those are the most important ones when you're facing also some kind of spatial conditions. Or I know it from a lot of other works we did in southern Italy, that there was really one side, Italy itself has developed bureaucracy as a tentative, to find some kind of situation, a complete parallel situation. The loss of a state created an informal activity, created on that borderline, created not just an informal activity but crime. And as a response, the state created, although he had not this kind of power, he created artificially a kind of a bureaucracy. So on one hand you have a context where a lot of very interesting spatial things are happening, because people are trying to find their own way within a specific situation. And parallelly, you have a officially a super-regulated country, but where also the regulation is based on negotiation, and or like the Italian law system is the same. It's something of interpretation, and it creates a constant discourse of interpretation, and it creates a parallel. So it's very interesting that within Europe you have this different kind of phases, what cultures and what kind of state bureaucracies are produced by these kind of cultures, and all these space phenomena which are arising within this context are extremely stimulating, but are extremely different, really, by a section of 100 kilometers going to north. And that's, I think, so it's not just a city and village problem, but I think it's also a cultural phenomenon.
Yeah, Marjetica, I'm curious to know, when you're commissioned, whether it's from an art space or by a community, to enter into a public realm and implement something like a community garden, what is it that sets you apart from the classic social worker or community gardener as an artist, and how do you make use of that?
Well, that's a typical question, I must say. Thank you for asking. I think a social worker is just doing more or less one-dimensional work. But as an artist, you are, first of all, I think you are doing two things that a social worker wouldn't necessarily do. This is to build the imaginary with people, how to build in the future. So you have an added value to the project, which is imaginary. And then second is how to find a way to change the system. It's always these kinds of projects are always tools how to change a culture of living, including the regulations. Good?
What would be the imaginary? Just maybe an example of how that manifests itself.
Okay, the imaginary in Caracas, for instance, that's a good question again. So we started to work on infrastructure solutions in informal city of Caracas, which existed there already for 50 years. Caracas has a very big university where, like a very known architectural school, also very famous campus, which I think is like architectural, UN architectural monument. So there were like many architects that devised ideas how to resolve the infrastructure problem in the barrios, the water, electricity and sewage system, but they always thought in big, like large-scale modernist terminology. So it's basically we who came from the outside, they started to think the same way on like small scale and self-built solution. So this is, for instance, something, and of course this was also the time that also some architecture groups started to work in the same way. So in a way we should also learn from the barrio, because I think personally the 21st century will be really questions about infrastructure. So can we learn from the informal city, which used to be just put down as a negative social space or not successful social space? But actually, if you look at the situation, more than half of people who live in the cities live in such conditions. So there is a lot that we can also learn from their experience.
Can I comment on this? Yes. Yeah. I would like to comment on this matter of the imaginary. I think that for me, one of the most inspiring or more provocative texts that I've been reading lately is the abstract 1,000 Machines by Gerald Raunig, where he ends this lovely elucidation of 1,000 Plateaus, talks about abstract machines as these elusive mechanisms, social mechanisms that kind of emerge and disappear in order to elude capital power structures, and that the artist, and he, not unlike the Invisible Committee and the Coming Insurrection, about the artist and potentially the protester also becomes this agent to deploy self-organization in society. And I think, and this goes full circle again, to strengthen, I think, that the possibility of the artist being multidimensional as opposed to the community work. I love this answer, that is a unidimensional as the government community worker. Yeah.
And I think we got somehow stuck with current imaginaries, modernist imaginary, which is already behind us. It's already, questioned, and the current one, the neoliberal model, is also questioned. And we really need another imaginary to be able to go forward. I think it's very important for not only for individuals but also for societies to have an imaginary that somehow that we work towards or we live towards.
So a follow-up question. I have a follow-up question around the forms of mediation of the work. So on the one hand, the work is in the community gardens in Amsterdam. There are also many other sites in which we receive it, including your beautiful drawings that you used for the presentation here, and potentially also its translations into various other institutional contexts like museums and galleries. And so I'm wondering, I guess in the platform by Iris' presentation where she spoke about the translation of that research project into a work for exhibition, yes, and so I'm wondering if we could maybe talk a little bit, sort of heralding the following panel on curatorial work and exhibitions as a format as to how we're to understand, within, I guess, many of these work, this translation of the work as such to these institutional spaces and the value that might remain in them for other types of audiences beyond the target of the social aspect.
Art, we need art because it mediates our relationship with the world, so actually it's a very basic thing in our society. Maybe it's not valued so much, but it is important. But then I also exhibit a lot in museums and galleries, and I think that This is also important because museums have always been spaces of educational institutions, and you just reach a different kind of language. I think that's super important. For instance, in the museums I built many times architectural case studies, like I was just I think talking before with Francisca about or someone else about Caracas, House from Caracas, which is an architectural case study that I just currently exhibited at the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin. It was very interesting that they approached me by somehow museum being suddenly politically correct, and he said, well, there are so many people who live in informal architecture, can you do an architecture case study from Caracas for us? So this was very interesting, but I think it's also important because architectural case studies, for instance, a building from Caracas, informal city, actually is analysis of the language and of this particular architecture, and I believe that the architecture tells you the language of the society you live in. I'm sure.
Maybe an address.
For me, the process I follow when I'm offered to show in that other space is very much, I take very much in consideration the space and the history of the space and the society that is implicated and is living there. But at the same time, I follow an axis in my work, and my aim is to kind of, without being didactic, to blur sort of a boundary between the audience and the actor. And this is done through the insertion of these sort of staging tactiques, like a mise en scène context in the work, which actually creates a spectator that is critically engaged in the work.
Maybe this brings us to a good point. We are dealing with space matters, that we're picking up on your last thought, that all of you in your work do not, as an artist I'm speaking now, engage with an audience, but with a participant. This is a great move that is happening in all of your work. You're not doing your work for clearly an audience, but rather for a participant that engages with your work, whether it's a garden, or it's a big exhibition, spaces that they walk through, whether they have to engage or they have to climb on the bus stop, whether they walk inside the terminal. So there's a form of engagement and participation rather than purely presenting to an audience.
I mean, I think that, I mean, I'm throwing the stone to the next group, but I think that what Felicity, I think, is bringing up about whether the gallery space or the institutional space is becoming an effective mediator of artistic action is a highly questionable situation, and I think this has cut the work out for the independent curator. I think the independent curator is the crisis in the art. It's like the embodiment of the crisis in artistic practice today. This conversation about our curatorial overreach, about how to deploy self-organization and removing the curator as a figure and concentrating on curatorship as opposed to playing the role of curator. I think, of course I'm trying to provoke this, but I think that is a very important discussion to understand, again, when one removes these institutional frameworks, which I feel that they are certainly taking themselves out of the game because of the heavy commercialization and the compromise of compositional integrity of art, that we're finding ourselves having to become, active participants of creating situations for ourselves as opposed to engaging institutional spaces. So, and I think that Berlin Biennial is where that crisis is mostly represented.
But all of the projects that you guys have spoken about were by invitations of institutions and curators, right? So it's
not all of them,
but all of the ones that have been spoken about today, no? Or Kabul, San Museum, Remap, and yours is South Michigan.
Yeah. No, and I was very grateful to hear yesterday Marcus Mason, because I think it was brilliant, his analysis. And I think there are, in every process, yeah, we have to understand obviously the social rules, and I think participation, yeah, as a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy for a better world, I think it's completely wrong. I think there are some cases where it really works, but it's really how you, for example, in the $1 Million Hotel, the reality was already there, no? But there was no evidence of a kind. They self-organized themselves in a good way, in a bad way, but something was really missing. And just by a new element coming in within this kind of thing, and trying also, that puts us also again to the question, in my opinion, of infrastructure and plateaus, in terms of there's one power of the informal, but there is also something which sometimes we have to add. It's a little bit like the romanticism of this kind of self-organized houses. The problem of us is mass. Now we are too many now. And we can always decide to create this kind of road like a city situation. Or we gather together in smaller communities. And I think that's also the nice thing. How can smaller communities organize themselves, but then creating collective ideas, and also like of sharing of energy. If you look at power plants, how you can organize things. So I think it has really to do also with taking both sides, the best of both. It's like a little bit like the analysis of Kohlhaas when he went to Lagos at the beginning, this euphoric idea that how fantastic it was. Oh, on these highway nodes they organized this market, etc. And then this call when he found out, but in the end they were able to organize it on the infrastructure put on by colonialism, you know? So you needed the highway and the other thing to make it very efficiently. Or that's also something which I found really interesting in all this project in the barriers, the informal strategy combined with an infrastructure, you know? Or how, where does the water come from, one side, and yeah, to combine these two kind of knowledges, I think it's really extremely important. But yeah, and I think I would really speak also about what it's imposed by reality. You know? Where are the niches where we can work, and where do we have possibilities to move them? What like Marcus Mies yesterday, the boring job now of getting involved in Stuttgart before it was already too late. No? And therefore I think it has to be a combination of both kind of things.
Yes, I have a question for Marjetica and also I guess for Michael about what happens afterwards when you leave, and to what extent there's some kind of effectiveness or sustainability. In particular, I guess with the community gardens, you were saying that there was some issue about ownership and who was going to take that land or that value once the project was done.
I was talking about placemaking. This is a different thing. Yeah, so placemaking is just a ritual that any group that wants to be recognized does while it goes towards having a physical space. So this is placemaking. But then is, yeah, I don't, but, okay. I can talk about it. But just I want to add another thing about your question. What is the role of such projects? The role of such project is to empower the communities to be able to just do their own thing, and also to tell others how to do it. So the projects usually, what I call, have babies and they grow, and that's my ultimate idea. I don't stay with the communities. I just like form the project with them.
But what if nothing happens afterwards and it dies? What if it?
Well, if the project, if you do the project right, it never dies. It just makes it changes itself.
I mean, I think
it's for instance, I'll tell you, like the dry torch in Caracas, people built others themselves. The community garden in Amsterdam doesn't exist anymore but it brought, it started many other community gardens, just to make.
I mean, I think what's great about the panel too is that to see Michael's project and and it seems almost like a lesson learned from art, the self-initiative and the self-validation of projects, which one can see in a lot of architectural practices today. I see somehow as coming from an artist's perspective, that one works and one validates one's work by him or herself. But it almost seems that when an artist is so involved in the kind of I wouldn't say livelihood, but the kind of life world of a community, the success of a project can no longer be self-validated in the same way, and it's validated by the people that you're working with, right? Is there a danger of then losing some kind of that artistic autonomy in the work?
Maybe you can answer both questions.
Yeah, I think it's a very fundamental question, honestly, and you can all work on the imaginary, but if we specifically, we worked there in 2005, then we were invited again in 2006 by the population itself, but since then it works, strangely. I mean, nobody was thinking about that. And then we tried to understand what was happening now, just learning from Potrč in a certain way. And what kind of typology of person we needed now that it was successful. And we tried to analyze, could we repeat the phenomenon? And obviously you could never repeat it in a certain kind of way, but is there a kind of social typology you need that these things could happen? What are the values on site now? And also, we are still also in communication, have become friends. But it's really amazing how it continued to work, and it had also this kind of personal methodology for everybody involved. Once there was this, therefore we were also trying to invite curators because we were like anthropologists too much into the field, we had no idea. It was successful on site, it was amazing. So the image just reflects the byproduct in a certain way. But then, we have no idea. Then we took one little part of the budget to invite curators and to tell us it is complete crap. And they were so enthusiastic, and so they started to spread the voice. But strangely enough, it still continued. Because for one, it was also a transformation of an abandoned part. For one, it was the remembrance of the adventure. For the other, it was really a possibility to get in contact. So everybody has read something else within it. But it was really also important that also we tried to keep in touch. And that was now it's 2012, and now there was the invitation to the Maxi for this. And this, obviously, that was our aim then to connect the exhibition with the possibility to construct something new there. And so it's a commitment by them, but also a commitment by us in a certain way. But it has to be so powerful, obviously, that it could happen. But I also agree to that what Marjetica says, that sometimes just an idea remains, which is so powerful that something else can arise.
Maybe two more questions and then we're out. I'm very thankful for both of your questions for the afterlife of such projects. Apart from the fact that it's one of the topics that I've been very deeply engaged in the last years, but you showed the whole Earth Catalog as one of the sources of inspiration at the beginning. My favorite book by Stuart Brand is actually How Buildings Learn. She did much later, and it's what happens to buildings after they're built, where he really tells the story of the afterlife. There's a building process, there's something happening, there's no people that really happens after. He terms this expression fiasco by fiasco approach to perfection, that you have to you have to fail, you have to do failures, but they become, quote another one that James Joyce said, failure as a portal to discovery. So you meet these failures as well, particularly if you're engaging in spatial design, where you're always confronted with people. That this is permanent. Two quick last questions and quick answers before we go on lunch break.
My question is more, because there are lots of students here, more about how you equip yourself for doing this type of work. Like if we accept that design is kind of always transformative and driven by this transformative power, and the conventional architectural work would be like without engaging with the people who would use it, but you would like really impose these ideas you have to make things more harmonious or so. But
in these works and the things we saw yesterday, you have to be very personally engaged with these people. I'm asking practically how do you get ready for such work, and connected with the discussion yesterday about education. How like, whereas the field is supporting these types of works, the education we provide is not much about this personal equipment, let's say.
I think the most dangerous things about architectural education is the hidden curricula. No? The idea of what an architect is, but not given by lectures, but by the professor itself. No? So I think there's an incredibly strong mythology, you know, what an architect is. Never reflected, but just lived by persons. And I've seen many schools with these kind of figures. And then I think there should also be a kind of that kind of self-reflection in a certain way. But obviously there's, I think, yeah, the world is big. I mean, there's room for everybody in terms of. I think for certain, everybody searches his own specific conditions, obviously. And yeah, and if we are already a collective, that means we are ready to dialogue already. And that was so. One fundamental part of us is what you can talk about, but there is always a personal side of what you don't can talk about. I'm really an old Wittgenstein fan in that sense. No, but and there is an imaginary of everybody of us five, and we have also collaborators, although have an imaginary. So there are things we can talk about, and we talk about those things, and the others are things we negotiate with each other. But I think this of what we can talk, we can also talk to an audience, no? And because there are topics which are involving human beings with a wish to have adventurous life or a possibility of communication. I mean, those are not topics which come from us. They come from us. No? If they touch us, if we are not able to touch them, so they are completely worthless in my opinion. If this kind of architecture is disappearing, it's okay, because it doesn't fulfill our deepest wishes. But obviously you have to have a will, obviously, to communicate, to create, yeah, like a platform. You have to give something, obviously you define the platform, and that defines a lot. But yeah, that's my opinion.
I just would like to give a little more concrete answer to the question, in the sense of, like, for me, in my case, I think that understanding conceptual art was fundamental in my understanding of how design can become productive and affirmative, you know, so a strong understanding of contemporary art of the last 30 years, I think would be very fruitful. Obviously, longer than that, but this could be very useful. And then I also think that the understanding of how new technologies are impacting the way art is produced, from fabrication to conceptual, in the conceptual notion, I think to equip yourself with those kind of techniques and those kind of technologies could bring you forth to potentially affirmative practice. And I think you should try that.
I think basically also since you are like in the context of the school here, university, I think it's very important not to just, very simple, not just to learn from the books, but to learn on the ground, to construct your case studies, not the case studies that you learn from the books, because then you also are able to change the knowledge that is offered to you by the university. I think that's super important.
Someone that has graduated recently enough, and I've not been exhibiting for years in public space, but I want to return to this failing process and this trying out and taking the risk and the honesty to follow access in the work. And I think this is what, in the longer term, will, if not from the first attempt, but in the continuation of this, will establish a relationship and a contact and a dialogue and a common language with spectators.
Last question,
I was also thankful for the question for the afterlife.
I just wanted to go back short on this because in Marjetica's case, I'm really sure that it has a strong effect project on the social life, on the people's community of the neighborhood, and so on. I think this is quite obvious. In Michael's case, I'm not really sure. Maybe you can tell us about the effect. Is it the effect of attention to the village, or does it really change something there? Does the infrastructure develop, the people's life change? I mean, you said it's the problem of shrinking and so on. Does it really have this kind of effect, or is it just the attention that people come and stay there and then go again? And in Iris' case, also the question, I mean, it's you made such sensitive work on cultural history of Greece, for example. Does it go back to the country, and does it have any effect, or do you get any reaction on the project? Are you communication with them? Is there, I mean, is something like bringing something back and communicating about history as an artist?
There's a very concrete example, actually. The last project I made for the hotels are pretty much a myth in Greece. I mean, pretty much everyone that is in the arts or architecture will know about this case. But the tobacco factory actually was a discovery that I sort of helped to rethink about, and people had completely forgotten about its existence, and the most important of all, they didn't even know about its new role, which is the biggest library in Athens right now. So for me, it was a very, very important comment to work on that building in a very non-didactic way. But I saw very recently, for example, there were an architectural team that reworked and did an interview and created these walks in the... Actually, I didn't even have permission to go in, so I had to get permission from the parliament to go in the building. And after this, now they are making walks, and they have permission for public to visit the building. So I think it's small, little small steps. Sometimes they have a bigger impact. Sometimes it's very small, but.
Yes, I think you should not confound the metaphor of the hotel with the project. I think there was one is the process on site that we were invited to make a project about identity, and so we were not invited to make a hotel, nothing, but we used this kind of metaphor of this hotel, of the diffuse hotel, to reconquest and transform the public space in the town, and with the skills of the people itself, because it was completely abandoned. And so they started with us this process, and the nice thing was that they continued, no? Because the guys on site found us, what should we do? Because they are still building other rooms now, and that was the nice thing, that they have taken now this part. They have been, it's a new square. There was this kind of cinema projections which they started with this kind of thing. So in the end, it was the transformation of these kind of cells in the public domain. They really used it for themselves, because 90% of the time it's them which are there. And it was also the first time as a process where the young people and the old worked together. And we had enormous, it was, the problem is about that project, you could make a presentation of 2 hours and show the films, because that was for us the most striking thing, is that the image for us had no importance at all, and the project at the end. But it seems that they were strong enough and that people had an idea. But the process itself, when we were on site, we were speaking about this, the good aspects of migration, the transformation of the role of the women, which has not been possible without the ones which came back with fresh ideas, from Switzerland, and had the idea what a woman could also do. But obviously also to give them back also the honor that we came from outside and we appreciated their skills, no? And and they really make the whole kind of, this new park was completely renovated by them because the state doesn't care. There's no public money. And so they went in on site and gave really all their energy, and this was just an excuse. This hotel was just a blunt excuse for these kind of things. And obviously it gave them attention, but they don't care about the attention. I mean, the attention, it's the first time we needed PR to make it happen, because that's what we wanted. It's, the young guys are leaving, no? It's not cool. That's, I know it's a strange term, but it's one of the most essential things for young people. And by bringing other cool guys or persons from the Netherlands to the place and saying, wow, because I think it's like a camp, it's so fucked up, the place. And if you go there, you have to will to accept the conditions, because it's, the warm water is just, because it's public electricity, it's taken off of public electricity, you have to make the shower between 22 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the morning, so it's not a luxury hotel at the end. And I think all this kind of process, that was, it was community shaping through this kind of process. And then they continued, and some of them has taken this as public space. And so obviously there was an attention scale, but not for them. In the end, it's some people were coming around, but it was the process itself, I think, was important. But it was a problem to be a hotel. We were just overrun by the situation. So,
looking at the time, I will cut the panel right now and invite you all to continue the discussion we had in the free time for the moment. To